Hi guys, my name is Isabel and today I'm going to be talking about my favorite Disney movie of all time, Pocahontas. I think that this movie is often not given the credit that it deserves because of historical inaccuracies, but I think it's actually a really priceless treasure within the Disney vault. I'm going to be talking about the 5 main elements that should be reviewed in a Disney film, which are animation, soundtracks, characters, story, and impact on kids. And those are, I think the most important factors for how a Disney movie is criticized and how it is lauded by the general public. So without further ado, let's get to it. So let's talk about the first one, animation. I think what a lot of people don't really consider about Disney movies when looking at them is their color scheme, and I think that's something that we should look at because Pocahontas' color scheme is beautiful. All of the colors fit their scenes and fit the tone and the mood that the scenes are trying to portray really well. I think also what's important is the fact that this particular Disney movie uses a lot of pastels, which is kind of unusual. It also makes a big contrast when we see the blood red sunrise in the Savages Part 2 song, because as an audience member, you're struck by the contrast, the tension that comes out of this color, because previously you'd been seeing, John Smith and Pocahontas fall in love by the riverside with all of these pastel colors around the landscape and the sky, and then all of a sudden, it's blood red, it's tense, it's bloodthirsty, and that contrast in itself is just amazing. As for the actual animation style, I think what we can all agree is that Pocahontas is not one of the most beautiful Disney princesses. Unfortunately, she did fall prey to that cliche of over-exaggerated beauty standards, so we've got a very disproportionate amount of chest for a very small waist. Her eyes are small, her nose is small. She does not have the features of a typical Native American, so I think a lot of people had a problem with that. I'm gonna give her some points off for all of the scenes with her hair flowing in the wind, because we all have to admit that was beautiful, beautiful animation. But as for her whole figure in general, I think it's too disproportionate to be considered, admirable. But on the other hand, we did have that amazing sequence where her face was made out of the wind, and we zoom back to see her whole body and getting colored in colors of the wind. So I think that also deserves some points off for the animation. Next, let's talk about the soundtrack. I think everyone's first example when they think of Pocahontas is Colors of the Wind, which is understandable because it is, I think, the main song and probably the most beautiful in the way that its message may seem kind of vague or meaningless in the lyrics, but if you look closer, it's actually a really deep and inspiring message about overcoming prejudice and trying new things with new people. So I think that's a really healthy message to weave into a song for kids. Also, what people tend to overlook in this movie is the fact that its soundtrack is beautiful and carries the film. I'm talking about the little 1 to 4 minute segments of scenes that underlie the dialogue and the animation, because they're just also amazing. They have great instrumental power. They also just completely set the tone of the scene. They bring in the tension or the romance, and I especially love the way that the finale, the farewell score, interweaves all of these heavy hitter songs like Colors of the Wind and If I Never Knew You with the small little pieces that we heard throughout the film to give it this well-rounded conclusion, and also just the fact that it makes it seem even more satisfying and brings out these themes of overcoming prejudice and empowerment is just really masterfully done. I will say that on the negative side of the soundtrack, we don't have many particularly well-known songs. I think a lot of them on the soundtrack are kind of forgettable, like Steady as the Beating Drum, or Mine, 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 But I think Mine, Mine, Mine is actually a good villain song in the way that it portrays Radcliffe, because of the way that it's so saturated with his greed. But I would say that it's not the most powerful Disney villain song, especially when compared to the likes of Poor Unfortunate Souls or Hellfire or Friends on the Other Side. And the other thing that this soundtrack is missing that a lot of Disney soundtracks do have that make them more lively is the fast-talking sidekick dance number like Be Our Guest or Under the Sea or Friend Like Me. So all of those things combined, I would say that it's more of a forgettable soundtrack, but I still would argue that the presence and the use of these small soundtracks as well as the heavy hitters help carry the soundtrack. Now let's move on to part 3, the characters. First, let's start with Pocahontas because she is the title character. I think Pocahontas is honestly one of the best Disney princesses because although she's not new to the scene, she is really the first empowered Disney female. And the reason I say that is because she has the ability to stop a war, and she never ever hesitates to use that ability. And she actually uses her power for good things, for the good of her people. She's also got that playful, kind of curious side that I think a lot of kids can relate to, but at the same time, she is a strong, decisive, and brave young woman, so she's a really positive role model for young girls. If we talk about John Smith, I think we can see that he's also a really multi-dimensional character because he has this good development in his character arc where he goes from being the arrogant, conqueror to becoming enamored with Pocahontas and everything she stands for in the land. He becomes willing to learn about her, to throw aside his prejudices. He is completely willing to accept new cultures, which is also a positive role model. And now if we talk about Radcliffe, I think as a villain, he does decently. He seems very fixated on his greed, and he just falls a little bit flat in the villainy department because of that. As mentioned earlier, we don't have a fun, fast-talking sidekick, only, the animal sidekicks. So I would give them points off for possibly lessening the appeal of the movie by having no real comedic character. But we can talk about how the comedic elements affect the story in the next part. Because we ended last segment with talking about comedic value, that's where we're going to pick up now. I think a lot of people would say that this story does not have a lot of kid-friendly vibes because of its lack of comedic value, but I would say the opposite. I think that the lack of comedic effect, I would say that those actually enrich the story and they draw out the tension and the suspense and, the romance. And speaking of romance, let's talk about the love story that develops between Pocahontas and John Smith. First of all, it's one of the best because of the fact that they actually spend time with each other, learning about each other, and getting to know each other before they accept, their feelings for each other. And with every other Disney movie, it seemed that they were focusing on love at first sight or a sort of unrequited love or undeveloped love. And I like the fact that this Disney movie has a more realistic approach to romance and how it ends. And, speaking of endings, let's talk about the story's ending. I think that this is probably one of the best reasons why Pocahontas is such a great movie because it, spurns the traditional Disney ending. Romance in this movie is not the be-all, end-all of Pocahontas' existence. She realizes that she has a responsibility and she takes it. She doesn't ever shy away from the empowerment that she gets from leading her people. And I think that in itself is a really good message for young girls to have. I know that a lot of people don't like this movie because of its historical inaccuracies, and I will take a moment to acknowledge that, because definitely no romance ever existed between John Smith and the, 10-year-old Pocahontas. But I like the fact that the romance or the journey to romance is not what's driving the story. It is Pocahontas's own, willpower, her determination to make sure that there is no war between her people and the settlers, and that makes the story just overall really powerful in my book. Lastly, I want to talk about the message that this has for the young audience that's watching it. Pocahontas is, as I mentioned, one of the unconventional Disney movies that doesn't end with a marriage and a happily ever after. However, as I said, I think that this is a really empowering impact for young girls. I think that if they learn through every other Disney movie that the goal of their entire journey, their whole narrative, is to find romance, then they're not ever really finding themselves or being empowered. But because of Pocahontas's determination, she ensures that she never gives up her own self or her sense of responsibility to be with a man, even though the ending is heartbreaking in that sense. But I think that's also what makes it such a good ending, because it subverts that trope. The impact on young kids who watch this is pretty good, except for the historical inaccuracies, because lots of people will point them out to the kids as they get older, and they'll learn that there is this legacy of colonialism and racism. I think it's good to expose kids to that, but also a good way to counter that is to expose them to the idea that there are people like John Smith and Pocahontas who are willing to play the diplomat, who are willing to make sure that their people do not come to war. So overall, I would give this a pretty high score in terms of impact. So there you have it. That's my total review of the movie Pocahontas from Disney. The characterization and the story and the message that it sends are pretty strong. I think the animation and the soundtrack could probably use a little work. I think hopefully that you guys will have improved your opinions. If you were pretty skeptical about Pocahontas, maybe go watch it another time and you'll see all of these things that I'm talking about, and maybe you'll feel empowered too. If you have another opinion, or if you have another Disney movie that you want me to review, comment it and I'll see what I can do. Thanks for watching.